So let me do that first, and then this one. Okay, I told you last week that we will cover chapters 18 to 23. This appears to be a fairly good combination of chapters. The common element in these chapters is that they're constantly oscillating between judgment and some hope passages, though we probably should say that the judgment sections are still pretty heavy at this stage in Ezekiel. All right, for this section we will do a summary of each chapter, and in one of the chapters we will go a little deeper into the text to talk about what Ezekiel was asked to present. In chapter 18, we meet the idea of individual retribution. The chapter begins with a proverb that God quotes and says, "You like to quote this proverb? Oh, here's what's going to happen." This is as clear a translation as we can make. Parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's mouths pucker at the taste. The idea is parents have eaten sour grapes, but it's as if the children can feel that sourness in their mouths. God says, "You like this? Okay, this is what's going to happen to you." In this chapter, we find twice verses that many Adventists in the previous generations, like my dad's and grandpa's generation, love to use. The person who sins is the one who will die. The fact that it's stated twice gives us a clue that sin has a very individual dimension to it. And we need to have a look at this. Even though the people of Judah saw the captivity as a collective punishment, you know how that phrase is being used in today's geopolitics, collective punishment. But Ezekiel argues for the fact that every person has responsibility for themselves. You can't simply say, "Oh, because my parents did it," or "because so and so did it," or "Yeah, I can't help it. It's human nature. It's society I live in." None of those things would work. And so he goes through what happens within a family. He says that if a father is righteous, then he is judged by that righteousness. And this is important because neither righteousness nor sin is transferable from generation to generation. There are certain health issues that are genetic based that can pass from generation to generation. And there are passages in the Torah that seem to imply that even sin or the judgment for sin can be passed from generation to generation. Ezekiel brings a rebalance into that equation. So a righteous father is judged for his unrighteousness. It's almost painting the picture that what God does when he looks at people, he looks at the sum total of their lives, not at the individual acts, and then makes a decision. Now, that righteous father may not have a righteous son. His son may become completely evil. For example, King Ahaz was a really evil king, but his son Hezekiah was considered a godly king. Likewise, Manasseh was a very evil king, but his son Josiah, I think it is, yes, Josiah, was really righteous. So an evil son will be judged for his evil. He doesn't benefit riding the coattails of his father, nor can he claim any, like in most courts of law these days, you can get some claim, especially involving so-called insanity issues, that, they can't help it. This is something in the family, in the genes. No such thing. So if the son moves away from the father's paradigm of righteousness to a life of evil, then he will be judged his sum total on that. But a righteous grandson will then be judged for his righteousness. Notice that nothing is passed from generation to generation. And in the lives of the kings of Judah, you can actually see this happen. Where Ahaz was evil, his son Hezekiah was good, his son Manasseh was evil, Manasseh's son Josiah was good, so you have this back and forth. And it's important to use the example of the kings of Judah for one simple reason. The 20 kings of Judah all are genealogical descendants of David. We all came from the same family. Unlike the northern kingdom of Israel, which had so many different dynasties and so many different assassinations, Judah's kings had this continuity of history. And it's an amazing thing that Josiah had a very evil father. His father was Amnon. His grandfather, Manasseh, was very evil. And yet he became one of the most righteous kings of Judah. And so Ezekiel, in a way, is using something from their own history, because most of the people who were exiled with Ezekiel at this point, they knew the history of Judah. They probably knew some of those kings or stories about those kings. So Uzziah was an almost good king. He was mostly good, made one serious mistake. Ahaz was pure evil. Hezekiah was mostly righteous, but made one mistake near the end of his life. Manasseh was evil. Amon was evil. Josiah was perfect, in his relationship with God. It's an amazing history that they have. And so when you look at that family of David, you find about half of those kings, after the kingdom split up, were considered godly, half were considered ungodly. Whereas the 20 kings of northern Israel, everyone was considered ungodly. And so it doesn't hold true that a son becomes like his father, even though a lot of psychological research will say things like a son who grew up with an abusive father is very, very likely to become an abusive father himself. But Ezekiel seems to say, since God measures sin on an individual basis, then it's possible individually to have a different relationship with God, for or against. And then he says this, that I'm using some modern language, there are no genetics base for either sin or judgment. So God will not punish the children because of what the father did. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a King Josiah or King Hezekiah. By the same token, the sin does not pass. As evil as Ammon was, his son was perfect in the eyes of God and in the historical records. And so you have this explanation about how sin works. Because very often Christians see some kind of infection, sin as a kind of infection, a virus, or a propensity. There are health propensities in different races. For example, among South Indians, there is a great leaning towards diabetes. And in some people, this is why doctors will ask you, if you go with high blood pressure, whatever. I discovered this the hard way. One of the first questions they will ask you, did anybody in your family have heart issues or heart problems? Okay. Because they see how that can be transmitted from generation to generation. But this doesn't apply to spiritual matters, because that's not how God works. God's work is completely individualized, which, of course, if you were a Jew sitting beside Ezekiel as he's preaching this, and you're all collectively punished, it would seem, being there in the river Kebar in Babylon, you'd be wondering, is that really true? Then how come all of us are here? But there is that side to the experience of Israel itself. Okay, but he's arguing here for personally, just because your father was one way, you don't have to be that way. And so in verse 30, though, he ends the chapter by reminding that the reason all of this happens, all these different equations, is that when all is said and done, God is a God about redemption. God is more concerned about redemption and salvation, and even judgment is seen as being redemptive. The only judgment that is non-redemptive is what we call the lake of fire in Revelation. All other judgments are redemptive. So when you read the threats of judgment against the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, there's always this, but if you, and so it's like God saying, okay, this will happen, but here's your opportunity. With the 10 plagues, with the 10 plagues of Egypt, you see that same potential. Moses was sent to warn the Pharaoh. And then when the Pharaoh appears to repent, the plague was removed. And then you have these 2 difficult expressions in Exodus. On the one hand, it says God hardened his heart. On the other hand, it says the Pharaoh hardened his heart. Now, for those of you who like statistics and mathematics, the expression Pharaoh hardened his heart outnumbers the expression God hardened his heart. See, there is neither predestination nor predetermination in terms of judgment, because God will sit and wait for the full picture to evolve before he makes final judgment. When I was a kid, they drove into our heads. I don't know if this happened in Jimmy's family, but it certainly did in mine. My sister Baki may be too young to remember, but this was driven into our heads that if you go to bed tonight and you have a sin you did not confess and your name appears in the judgment tonight, why it would, I don't know, then you will end up in hell for that one sin that you did not confess. It was a very scary thought. I don't know about all the kids, the church kids I grew up with, but I know that it bothered me endlessly, to the point that at one stage in my life, when I was around 13, 14, I created a spiritual graph chart that I stuck to my bedroom wall, bedroom I shared with my brother, where I tried to plot how my spirituality was for that day. Looking back at it, with many, many years of relationship with God and preaching the word, I realized that what I did was more about measuring my emotional state of mind, not so much my spiritual standing with God. It was kind of a silly thing to do, but it happened because of all the stuff I was hearing about God. It's like a judge with this long white wig and a gavel in his hand, stuff like that, waiting to pronounce guilty. You are destined for hell. God says this is not how it works. So here's Ezekiel. We are now getting close to the center of the book, and he's telling us that it doesn't work that way. It works one by one. You cannot, on the one hand, blame other people for your failures, spiritual failures, nor on the other side, credit other people for your spiritual successes, because humans will probably exhibit a little bit of both at one point or another. But remembering that God is all about redemption helps us even in our moments of failure. Okay, so that is chapter 18. Chapter 19 is a relatively long dirge or lament for Israel's kings. And basically, Ezekiel was told to do this. Says God told him, sing this funeral song for the princes of Israel. Imagine being a prophet and being asked by God to sing a funeral song for your kings. The word princes of Israel here was not just the kings. It included all positions of leadership. Okay, the kings, their sons, their families, and then other leaders, the counselors, and so on in the nation. So it's a broad term. That's why I didn't use the word king per se. And then it gives us the development of the history of the nation of Israel and the 2 parts of Israel and Judah in a very concise imagery. He says that there was a lioness who had a cub, but this cub was so wild it became a man-eater. And so it had to be defeated, and it was defeated and ended up in Egypt. Now, the reference here seems to clearly be the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, we know the northern kingdom of Israel was not destroyed by Egypt, but by Assyria. And so Egypt here is probably what we call a metonymy. a noun exchange rather than call Assyria, which actually did not exist anymore by the time Ezekiel came into the picture. So he uses the term Egypt, but actually meaning Assyria. This happened around 722, 721 BC, over 150 years before the Babylonian captivity. And Ezekiel would have known this history. He would have studied about it. He would have learned. Now, the kings of Israel, that northern kingdom, were always at war with Judah on the south, Syria in the north, and some of the Canaanite tribes in the east. And so they constantly looked to Assyria as their protection. They had alliances with various Assyrian emperors. Syria was the superpower during that period. But eventually, because they did not always live up to their terms within the agreement or the MOU with Assyria, Assyria finally invaded Israel, captured the city of Samaria, the capital city of Israel, and deported the so-called 10 tribes out of the land to Assyria and other territories of the Assyrian Empire. Now, the Assyrians also invaded Judah, but they were not able to fully conquer it. They did momentarily capture King Manasseh, but eventually they had to release. And the Assyrians had their biggest defeat by an act of God in invading Judah at the time of Hezekiah. But then the story goes on. He says that the lioness has a second cub, and this second cub also became a man-eater. Keep the story in mind. When we get to chapter 23, you will see that these two kingdoms were always in the minds of the prophet. And he was defeated, but he ends up in Babylon. And so this clearly is talking about the kingdom of Judah and the Babylonian captivity. So when we think of David's Israel, right after Solomon's death, it split not in half. It split 10 tribes versus 2 tribes. Well, two tribes plus one, the Levites, all went into Judah. And the southern part became known as Judah, taking on the name of the primary tribe. And it was approximately 1/3 the size of the northern kingdom. And the two were constantly at war with each other. Now, here's the intriguing thing. Both of them did call upon Egypt as an ally and discovered Egypt was not a very reliable ally. So Israel, the northern kingdom, turned more to Assyria. Judah first turned to Assyria alliances, then to Egypt alliances, then they also made alliances with Babylon. In both cases, their failure in the alliance led to the captivity. So when the Israel kingdom failed Assyria, Assyria destroyed them. When Judah failed Babylon, Babylon destroyed them. But notice that the length of time is quite different. Northern Israel was destroyed around 722, 721 BC. The final invasion of Nebuchadnezzar was 586 BC. So you have approximately Judah outlasted Israel by about 150 years. And there's a second imagery in this chapter, in this dirge, and that is the imagery of the failed vine. You know, the most common domestic farm plant in Israel, a fruit plant in Israel, was grapes, vines, because they provided fruit as well as a liquid and so on. And to have vines that don't bear fruit, and we see that in a song in Isaiah chapter 5. This is a recurring theme. It would appear in the Gospel of John, the importance of the vine, except that the vine will not be a nation anymore. It will be Jesus Christ who will be the vine. I came across a vineyard in Prachinburi or Ratchaburi, one of those Buri provinces, that had the most awesome grapes I have seen hanging from the vines. very large grapes, huge big bunches, reminded me so much of the grape bunches that the 12 spies brought from Israel at the time of Moses. I did not get to taste those grapes because I asked the gardener who was looking after the place, can I pick some? He said, no, sorry, they don't allow for you to do that. There are two main reasons why vines fail. One is weather related, the other is disease related. And so one is not really man-made. The other one could be partly man-made, by how we treat the plants and so on, and natural events. But in the vine imageries of the prophets, the vines fail because of human effort, not because of natural causes. So these kings of Israel, here the kings of Israel include both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Northern Israel and southern Judah were at stake. Now, this is interesting because when he made this prophecy, the northern kingdom didn't even exist anymore. It's long disappeared in history, over 150 years. And yet it would have been in their memories. And that is brought back in chapter 23 in another dual imagery similar to this one. All right, so that's chapter 19. Now we look at chapter 20. And chapter 20 is kind of hard to concise because it seems to cover three different motifs: rebellion, judgment, and restoration. Interestingly, this is a prophecy that is dated by Ezekiel. We actually have a very precise dating. In our calendar, it would be the 14th of August, 591 BC. In the Jewish calendar, it was said to be the 5th month of the 10th day of the 7th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity. Now, Jehoiachin was taken into captivity in 597, 598. Okay, so we have a pretty reliable dating for this particular prophecy. Now, why Ezekiel was so particular about dating this prophecy, we can never be sure. But what I've learned as I've grown older is that remembering the dates are very important to life. The dates when your child is born, the date when you got married, the date when you were baptized, the date of my first sermon in Singapore, the date when my best friend in life drowned. There are certain dates that stand, the dates of graduation, ordination, and so on and so forth. This must have had some significance to the people at that time, because this was not the final invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. There is one more king after Jehoiachin, and that is Zedekiah. But what happened with these last three kings, Jehoiakim, then Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah, is that they all attempted alliances with both Egypt on the one hand and Babylon on the other hand. They're trying to play politics. And total failure. All three kings are considered to be the weakest and the most failed kings of Judah. And this is the period when Ezekiel lived. So these were men that he saw. And Jehoiachin might have even been in that crowd in Babylon, if not in a royal chateau or something of his own. So who knows? What happened in this year, and I guess why it made such an impression on Ezekiel, is this. The exiles came to Ezekiel. Now remember, he's been there since 597, so he's also been there for some years. They came to him one day and he said, we need a message from God. They actually demanded a message. Give us a message from God. Ask God to give us a message. See, they were still very discouraged and depressed about being in Babylon, still hoping that the exile wouldn't last as long as Jeremiah had prophesied, since they never trusted Jeremiah's prophecies. So ask God to give us a message. We need a message of reassurance. And this is what happens. God says, fine, but here's my response. This is what the sovereign Lord says. How dare you come to ask me for a question or for a message? As surely as I live, says the sovereign Lord, the term here is Yahweh Adonai, I will tell you nothing. Pretty harsh response from God. I will tell you nothing. You want a message? You're not going to get one. You're demanding a message? Sorry. What right do you have to ask? There's another story in the Bible where God used this kind of language and this kind of tone. When Miriam and Aaron rebelled against Moses, and Moses never said a word in his own defense, God looks at this for some time and then he has had enough. It's very dangerous when God has had enough. He summons the three of them to the tabernacle, and then he tells Miriam and Aaron, how dare you challenge my servant Moses? Who do you think you are? With prophets I speak in visions, but with my servant Moses face to face. And Miriam was struck with leprosy. Aaron had to beg Moses to pray for her healing. And when he did, God told Moses, stop, don't even ask me to heal her. She will be a leper for 7 days. And here we meet a similar message from God. How dare you ask me any message? Now, here's the thing. From the time of Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Jeremiah, the prophets have been constantly bringing messages from God, warning about this captivity and why it would happen and how their sins were the primary reason for it. But they were never listened. Those prophets, nobody paid attention to them. Hosea had to live a completely wrecked home life to give that message. Nobody listened. Isaiah, at his commissioning, was told by God that it will go through one ear, out the other ear. It's quite interesting. It says they will look, but they will not see. They will listen, but they will not hear. Jeremiah was told that everybody will try to kill you because of this message I'm giving you, and you will have zero success. I'm writing a little essay right now on missiological patterns comparing ancient Israel with the Christian church. And it's quite interesting that in today's world, pastors are measured by secular KPIs just like any world organization does. If you transport these prophets, who are the rough equivalents to modern day pastors, into our world to pastor our churches, all of them will be considered failures. And yet, prophets were not measured by their success, but by their loyalty to God. This is why they insisted on using this phrase over and over. This is what the Lord says. You notice it here. This is what the Lord says. Ezekiel saying, it's not me. This is God saying. So God says, no, I will not give you a message. And then he follows through with a long list from chapter 20, verse 4 onwards, almost to the end, giving a litany of sins to explain God's disgust. A very similar litany appears in Isaiah chapter 1. It's amazing how the prophets often were given similar pictures of the conditions of their people. The chapter, however, just like the previous chapter, ends with hope. The ultimate destiny that God, after listing all of their sins, he then says this, on my holy mountain, the great mountain of Israel, says the sovereign Lord, the people of Israel will someday worship me and I will accept them. Now, you need to know that in today's particular climate, there are many Christians, Messianic Jews, and Jewish believers who believe that this is going to be fulfilled in our days, that the current war in the land of Israel is a preparation for this happening. The problem, however, is that the holy mountain is Mount Moriah. Okay, this is where the temple, the first temple, the second temple, Solomon's and Herod's temple stood. That was eventually Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple, the Romans destroyed Herod's temple, and eventually the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque on that same site. They see this prophecy as perhaps coming true very soon, which would mean the only way for it to literally happen is for those Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, to be demolished and a temple similar And Ezekiel does describe a temple. We will look at that separately towards the end of the book. Will be built on that spot. There is a museum in Jerusalem that has already prepared all the articles for that temple, except for Ark of the Covenant. They have the menorah, the table of the bread of presence, the little altar. Everything is ready for this rebuilding. And so there are lots of Christians, dispensationalist Christians in particular, Messianic Jews, and even other Jews who are seeing the war in Gaza as an eschatological war. This is not just another war with the Arabs, okay, but as one that is going to pave the way for the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. I told you when we restarted last week, those people were here, that this is a major headache for Adventists in dealing with the book of Ezekiel right now. Its popularity among the Christians, the Messianic Jews, and even the Jews themselves has just gone through the roof because of this particular war. And this is one of those prophecies that they believe is about to be fulfilled, because God seems to be making the claim here that one day he will bring his people back and establish them on that mount, the holy mountain, the great mountain of Israel. By the way, Moriah is not actually a mountain, it's more of a hill. It's not even 1,000 meters above sea level. But, it was the highest point in the land of Israel throughout its history. And that brings us to a very curious imagery, the imagery of the sword. This is pure judgment passage, but using the sword imagery. God says, I am against Israel. He uses a very harsh language. I am your enemy, and my sword is drawn. Now, he then tells them that Babylon is the sword of God. Habakkuk had the awakening of his life. Habakkuk, who lived pre-exilic period, so same era as Isaiah and Jeremiah, closer to Jeremiah's time. He was so disturbed by the social injustices, the violence, the corruption in the land, that he complains to God and he says, why aren't you doing something about this? God keeps quiet. And so he climbs up to we're not sure whether it's the top of the wall or the wall tower or the temple tower, probably the wall tower. He climbs up to that tower and he tells God, I'm going to stand here until you give me an answer. God says, fine, I'm going to give you an answer. And the answer is, I'm sending Babylon to cure the sins of Judah. And Habakkuk says, no, that's the wrong answer. What? Multiple choice for him? And so he said, I'm going to keep standing on this wall until you give me the correct answer, which God never did. And eventually he realizes that God's plans have their own way. And he ends up writing a beautiful psalm for that experience. So it was a spiritual awakening for him. But then God, and we begin to see more of this, and a lot of it in the next section we will cover next week. God now begins to speak about his sword being turned against other nations. He begins with Ammon. For those of you who know Bible history, this is one of the nations descended from one of the daughters of Lot. Okay. So slated for evil right from the beginning. What is interesting about this sword motif, I haven't put it here, but maybe you can put it as you remember in your brain. The first time we meet this sword motif as a judgment motif is in the Garden of Eden, when God placed the angel with this gigantic fiery sword so that Adam and Eve could not re-enter the garden and eat tree of life. The final image of Christ in Revelation chapter 19, before the millennium, is also Christ riding on a horse with a giant sword in his hand to harvest the earth. It's called the harvest judgment. And you see this again and again in the pre-exilic, the exilic, and the post-exilic prophets. Even Jesus made this statement. He says, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, a sword, by the way, in the Bible is not the symbol of war. The primary symbol of war in the Bible is the trumpet or the shofar. The sword is a symbol of judgment, That's why judgment is against Israel. Israel here means actually Judah, because Israel was really gone by this time, but it's also applied to other nations. And we will see next, in the next segment of passages, why the other nations are being targeted as well. Now, what is peculiar about this chapter is that Babylon is seen as God's sword. Now, in Isaiah, Persia is seen as the savior. He's actually called a Messiah of the people of Judah. In Ezekiel, Babylon is seen as the sword, the judgment. And so they are now going to perish under the sword, but also their enemies. When we open from chapters 24 to 20, to about 30, it's all about the sword against these other nations. And once in a while, it swings back at Judah as well. So the next few chapters we will look at is very significant because of this. And in chapter 22, he reverts back to sins, more and more litanies, but this time very specific, and we will look at the passages themselves. In the first 15 verses, he talks about the sins of the city, this collective happening. And he calls them city of murderers, city of idols. So you can see two primary forms of sins, societal and spiritual. And then he describes a different form of judgment, which the exiles in Babylon were probably going to learn a little bit later. It hasn't happened yet, but a little bit later, they would actually meet a furnace judgment put in place by King Nebuchadnezzar. But here God is describing himself as the furnace, how the furnace can melt gold and silver. But it's also pointing out the fact that the reason for putting gold ore and silver ore in the furnace is actually to refine them. You cannot get pure gold without putting it through the furnace. And then the rest of the chapter gives a list of the sins of the leaders. And three classes of leaders are included here: princes, these political leaders, priests, the religious leaders, and prophets. So two groups of leaders here are on the spiritual realm. One is on the secular or the political realm. Let's read what he says about the city of murderers. Okay, why did he call Jerusalem and its people the city of murderers, the city of idols? And this is why. The contempt by which parents were treated, the fact that foreigners, which the Torah says must be treated like they were citizens and provided special protection, the opposite was happening. The disenfranchised in society. The term orphans and widows is a term for any kind of disenfranchised. It's not just about orphans and widows, how they are being oppressed, no human rights. You despise my holy things and violate my Sabbaths. And Ezekiel constantly targets in this chapter and so on this violation of Sabbath. Quite interesting. People accusing each other falsely. You can actually find the 10 Commandments all in here. Okay, they are filled with idol worshippers who do obscene things. They copied the religion of the Canaanites, which involved everything from phallic worship to temple prostitution and so on. Men sleep with their father's wives and force themselves on women who are menstruating. The Torah does not allow sex during menstruation period. It was a way to control husbands' hormones and keep the wife safer. Within your walls live men who commit adultery with their neighbors' wives, who defile daughters-in-law, who rape their own sisters. You get the picture of a society that's completely gone awry. There are hired murderers, lone racketeers, extortioners everywhere. They never even think of me and my commands. Like I said, if you take this list of sins and compare it with laws in the 10 Commandments and in the book of Leviticus, you'll find all of those being included here. It's almost like they have completely, think of it in our day and age, it's like a Muslim society that breaks every Sharia law. Here was a society based on Torah laws, and it has broken every single one of these Torah laws. Now, when people do this is very repulsive to God. Because the sins here, when you look at the sins, there are some spiritual elements like holy things and Sabbath, but you will notice that most of the sins here have to do with people relationships, children and parents, foreigners and citizens. The world is still pretty good at exploiting foreigners. Israel are not supposed to do that. The commands of God were very clear that you do not exploit foreigners among you. Okay. How you deal with people in the lower strata of society. Okay. How you treat one another. Everything from incest to rape to, all kinds of crimes. I don't know if you were a lawyer in today's world, a DA, prosecuting attorney, and you find a group of people, an entire city of people that live like this, what would you say? This is kind of like driving through some American cities where the crime rate is so high that you don't dare to go there once the sun has gone down. I remember being chased on the I-95, I think it was, by this guy who got angry with me for cutting in front of him a little too quickly. And so to get away from him, I was headed to Chicago. I took off at the first exit into Chicago and ended up in a part of Chicago known as South Side. And the friends I was going to visit in Chicago had said, whatever you do not go through South Side. And I didn't know why. I got off the ramp, and as I'm coming down the ramp, there at the bottom of the ramp, in very big advertising, you can see as soon as you're coming down the ramp, was this huge sign set up by the police. This is high crime zone. I've never felt so unsafe driving into a city as I did at that moment. Nothing happened. But when I got out of South Side and got to my friend's place and told them where I had been, they were also very disturbed. Wow, you are so lucky. Imagine the description of Jerusalem here is more akin to Sodom and Gomorrah. And in other prophets, they have been compared to Sodom and Gomorrah anyway. And so that's what happened to these people. But what about their leaders? What is it that they are doing that God finds so offensive? And here it is. I've highlighted princes, priests, and prophets. So you can see the three groups of leaders. He says that princes are constantly plotting conspiracies. They devour innocent people, seizing treasures, extorting wealth. That idea of eminent domain or the land belonging to the monarchy, that was foreign to Israel under Torah law. Land is for everybody. They make widows in the land. Part of this was conscripting men for the army, and then, of course, having so many wars, a lot of men died. There's a long list for priests. Your priests have violated my instructions, defiled my holy things. They make no distinction between what is holy and what is not. Now that's a big one. They disregard my Sabbath days, so I'm dishonored among them. Your leaders are like wolves who tear apart their victims. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. They actually destroy people's lives for money. This was the thing that upset Jesus the most in the temple, watching these priests making money off the worshippers who come to the temple. And priests in Israel, unlike modern pastors, were extremely well paid. All the tithe of the nation belongs to the priests. It was amazing. And then prophets. They cover up for them by announcing false visions and making lying predictions. Even common people oppress the poor, rob the needy, and deprive foreigners of justice. Notice twice this idea of the ill treatment of foreigners appears in this passage. So everybody was doing the same thing. Verse 29 seems to indicate because the leaders are doing all these things, common citizens were like, oh, if they can do it, we can also do it. And generally, this is how crime works. So when you know that your political leaders get rich because of their ability to manipulate the finance system, you're likely to say to yourself, well, I can also do that. Why shouldn't I? When you read of leaders, practicing discrimination of any kind, anti-Semitism or discrimination against by religious categories or by national categories, you say, well, why can't I do that? I was just reading an article, I don't know if any of you saw this, about how North Korean workers are treated in China. And the article said that basically most North Koreans who end up trying to make money by going into China to work in China are treated as virtual slaves in China. This is the 21st century. And North Koreans are supposed to be the ally of Chinese government. And you find the same thing everywhere. Here in Thailand, these construction workers, most of them from Myanmar and Cambodia, I can hear them right behind my house as they speak. Have you ever seen how they're treated? They're put in these congested hostels. They are shipped around from construction site to construction site in overpacked pickups and so on. It's a little sad. Then Qatar, when it held the World Cup, how many construction workers were killed, but no human rights organization said anything about it. Okay. The rich always take advantage of the poor, but here's the sad thing: the poor will take advantage of each other as well. High crime rates exist in poverty-laden societies. I've even been to an Adventist village in Papua New Guinea, where every person in that village is an Adventist church member. And yet the village is such high crime rate that other Papuans don't dare to go to that village at night or spend a night in that village. So, Judah was in really, really bad shape. And then this section ends up with the story of the two sisters. It's an allegory, but explained all the way through. It says that the older girl was named Ohola and the younger sister Oholibah. God says that I married them, but they bore me sons and daughters. And then he says, I'm speaking about the two kingdoms, Samaria, the northern Israel, and Jerusalem of Judah. Ohola is Samaria, Oholibah is Jerusalem. Okay. So he's talking about what happened to the two kingdoms. Ohola lusted after other lovers instead of me, and she gave her love to the Assyrians. And that's exactly what they did. They had an MOU against the advice of God. They made alliances with Assyria because it was a superpower. They thought Assyria would protect them from the Syrians to their north and from Judah to their south. So what does God do? He says, I handed her over to the Assyrian lovers whom she desired so much. So in 722, the Assyrian armies invaded, burned down Samaria, and took most of the people out of the land of Israel. They were gone. Those 10 tribes eventually disappeared in history. There is a tribe in Manipur Mizo connection who claim they are one of the lost tribes. They name themselves after the tribe of Manasseh. And a few hundreds of them have been accepted into Israel as being part of that lost tribe. There was a rabbi who actually traveled to Manipur and verified that they were a lost tribe. They worship like Jews. They don't know Hebrew, but they follow the Torah. They have Old Testament names. And then the Ethiopic Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Yemeni Jews, these are all considered part of the lost tribes of Israel. So when the modern state of Israel was formed, one of its mission statements is the recovery of all the lost tribes of Israel. There is a tribe in the Pakistan, Afghanistan area that consider themselves one of the lost tribes of Israel. And the investigations are still going on as to whether they will be accepted by the rabbis. All it takes is for the Council of Rabbis to say, yes, they are one of the lost tribes, and then they will be given the right to transplant themselves to Israel. This is the amazing thing about the nation of Israel. No other country will ever do such a thing. And so if you walk through the land of Israel today, you will see all the different colors. The Yemeni Jews are Arabs. The Ethiopic Jews are Africans. The Moroccan Jews are also Arabs. And now if you have these Manipuri Jews, if they are fully accepted, some of them have already gone to Israel, then you're going to have Asian-looking Jews in Israel because of that belief. The tribes, Assyria disbanded them and scattered them all over the place. Babylon did not scatter Judah so much. Assyria did. An Assyrian empire stretched from Persia all the way to Turkey, so just scattered them all over the place. And then he talks about the second sister, Oholibah, saw what had happened to Oholah, her sister, but she followed right into her footsteps. She didn't learn from history. So Judah did not learn from the mistakes and the failures of the northern neighbor, despite their warfare, constant warfare. She was even more depraved, abandoning herself to her lust and prostitution. And then God says, I will send you lovers against you. Lovers here is an euphemism for, for enemies. I will send you lovers from every direction. The kingdom of Judah did not have a single ally around it. Even Israel in the north, Syria in the north were its enemies, Egypt in the south, Edom, Moab, Ammon, all those Canaanite tribes, and then Assyria, they were all against it. Judah existed through its 350 years of history surrounded by enemies. And it's interesting when you look at today's map, today's world, modern day Israel occupies largely what was the Judah's territory at the time, with a little bit of Galilee and Samaria. And again, like Judah during that period, modern day Israel is also surrounded completely by enemies. And modern day Israel is really Judah in the modern context, because the word Jew is derived from the name of Judah. So history is an amazing thing, seems to repeat itself. And it's happening all over again. Then God says, you will be fully repaid for all your prostitution. Your worship of idols, yes, you will suffer the full penalty. And that was the Babylonian captivity. But here's the difference between the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian exile. The Assyrian exile meant the total dispersion of the tribes to the point that they would vanish from history. The Babylonian captivity kept Judah together, basically in one place, all those people. Those who were not taken to Babylon ran away and stayed together in Egypt in one place. And so they maintained their identity, their race identity, their national identity. They kept it. The name Jew would replace the name Israel in Babylon. And then with the help of the Persians, they would return and rebuild the kingdom. So they did not get lost. And so the modern day Israelis, when the nation was formed, they knew that most of ancient Israel is scattered out there, lost somewhere in the world. And it's really just Judah and a bit of Benjamin and a bit of Levi that remain intact in history. So who suffered the greater punishment, the older sister, the younger sister? Well, it depends how you look at it after 2,000 years of history and so on. But in their lifetime, neither kingdom was better than the other. And their desire to play along with the superpowers around them was disastrous, to say the least. It ended up in exile in the case of Israel, total dispersion in the case of Judah, a rebuilding process in that captivity. And so in these chapters, we see some things stand out. Israel's and Judah's primary sins, two types. On the one hand, you have sins that we would consider spiritual sins, idolatry, following the other gods, and so on, and social injustice, what we would call societal sins, relationships between parents and children, foreigners and citizens, and so on and so forth. Israel's sins, however, are a consequence of a phenomenon that began from the Exodus. See, every time that Israel was challenged spiritually, they would fall. The reason for falling is this: they want to be like them. We want to be like the world. This is the primary failure of Israel. So in the desert, the worship of the golden calf, the desire to return to Egypt because somehow that was the safe zone. In the land, they wanted to be like the Canaanites, or the Asherah poles, the Bemas, and the Canaanite gods. They wanted a king rather than a God as king, because why can't we be like the other nations? And so this desire to play with the world and to be like the world would lead Israel into the wrong path. And when the kingdom split into, they never stopped that downward spiral. Even though Judah outlasted Israel, it also went on that spiral, driven by this phenomenon: be like them. Now, interesting, when you look at the Christian church today, it is living with the same mentality, to be like them. Or schools are run like them, or churches are organized like any organization outside, or finances are done like them, pastors are measured by secular KPIs like them, the hierarchies of the church operate like them, in a very political sense, and so on and so forth. So that's a very dangerous position that Christianity finds itself today. God is repulsed by sin regardless of where it occurs, even in Jerusalem, even in Zion. God is repulsed when sin occurs, and we find this in every prophet. But at the end of the day, God is always more about redemption and restoration. So even in judgment, God has restoration in mind. And so you cannot read any judgment passage in Isaiah or Jeremiah, Ezekiel or Daniel or Micah without reading redemption and restoration statements. Sometimes the judgment passages seem so many and the language is very harsh, and yet when you read the full book or the full sequence, you see there's always hope. There's always some light in this very dark tunnel. The point of Ezekiel is that Israel, the northern kingdom, had already disappeared, but Judah had reached the lowest ebb of history. And we see this happen to Israel more than once in history, where they reach this very low ebb, and God is so repulsed by his own people, and then he responds to that. Now, sorry, I need to share one more slide with you. Next week, we will cover a fairly lengthy chapter, but we can't break them up, 24 to 32, but also perhaps the most crucial chapters in the middle of this segment, dealing with the origins of sin. As more and more talk about sin and judgment, then God has to explain. There are only 3 passages in the entire Bible that address the origins of sin: Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation. So the connection between these 2 books to Revelation, particularly on that point, becomes very, very important. I will try to point out where in Revelation you see these thoughts from Ezekiel reappearing over and over. And so it's almost as if God sees the need to explain. If his people are so sinful, how does that happen? Where did sin come from? Why does it exist even in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be the holy city? So if even Zion can sin, what about the rest of the world? And God's response to sin is almost always, how shall I put this, redemptive judgment. Well, let's do some alliteration: redemptive retribution. God almost always uses that format. And so you find it with the Garden of Eden, with the flood story, with the Babylonian captivity, and with the final plagues in Revelation. That seems to be his modus operandi that God uses in dealing with sin. It repulses him, but he is more interested in salvaging it. Now, we eat a lot of mangoes in this country. The problem with mangoes is they can go bad pretty quickly. But even when they start to go bad, most of us probably don't, at least I don't, throw the mango away. I try to salvage everything that is still good and try to remove the part that is starting to be overripe and not looking good or tasting good anymore, because there's too much in that fruit to simply be thrown away. And I think that's the way that God approaches his people. It will be the same way in the book of Revelation as well, these judgments of God. And so if you have time again, like I said last week, try and read those chapters 24 to 32. It's a very long section of the book, but I think it's important that you at least have some reading sense of it before we actually look at the material next week. All right, let me stop the recording here.